We now have the pleasure of speaking about the documentary with Pramila Jayapal, the representative from the state of Washington, who's going to join us in a bit, and chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, Clive Lewis, Labor MP from Norwich South, and Anthony Barnett, the co-founder of openDemocracy. Now, crucially, we are here in this rather ominous moment in recent American history. Democrats have a window in control of Congress and the presidency after the attempted coup, and are appearing to be failing to confront the main threats facing the country, going after the minoritarian anti-democratic institutions of the US, such as the Supreme Court and the filibuster, and to deliver on campaign promises after an historic mobilization to defeat Trump. However, there is a new generation of progressive lawmakers that have been leading the charge and providing a vision for going after corruption and corporate influence and building a multiracial society grounded in economic and social justice. But do they have the time and the power? So the question we are going to ask today is, can US progressives beat back Trumpism? And I'd like to begin with you, Clive, as we wait for Pramila. I'm wondering what your feelings are when you're watching this film. And for those tuning in from the US unfamiliar with British politics, what threats do you UK progressives face? And do you think US progressive offers significant lessons for the UK left? Just please unmute yourself.
That's a good start.
Thanks.
Thank you. I mean, I think watching the film, it's a roller coaster. I think Ant's crafted it in such a way as to ask questions which are quite terrifying about the prospects of, he basically pitches it as before us are two choices, an authoritarian dystopian future under Trump or someone like him and the powers that are behind him, or a multiracial progressive future. And obviously I'm rooting for the second of those, but they are on a knife edge. And I think when you watch that film, you realize that it's not just in the US, as important as that is, where that's happening, it's happening all over the world at the moment. And I think one of the things in the film, which I think was probably assumed, but I know from speaking to Ant is definitely integral to it, one of the things that isn't mentioned is the climate crisis and how that is a massive antagonizing factor in this whole process. And we know that as that gets worse, the narrative and the ability for progressives to be able to make the argument in a period of crisis can sometimes become more difficult. There are also opportunities, but it can become more difficult. So I think there are things we can take away from this film, that there is hope. I'm really impressed at how better organized progressives in the US are than we are here in the UK. I was with a group of people, some of them what I would call new left members of parliament last night, who watched the film. And I think they were all deeply impressed when we saw the fact that there are people who are very clear, very left, very progressive throughout the democratic institutions, Democratic Party institutions in America, in Congress and beyond. And this intellectual capability to be able to explain very clearly on message what it is they want to achieve. They are on message, they are disciplined. And that's something I feel that we don't have here in the UK at the moment, but it's something that some of us are working on.
Great, and thank you so much for joining us, Pramila, Representative Jayapal. We really appreciate it. And you are the leading progressive in Congress. And I think for our international, I was wondering if we can start by asking you, our international audience is well aware of the threat of Trump for the US, but less clear about how deep it goes. And of course, because of the immediate significance of this leaked Supreme Court draft opinion on the overturning of Roe V Wade, I'm just wondering if you can respond to that and tell our viewers what your caucus and progressives are advocating in response.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And it's wonderful to hear a British member of parliament say we're more organized and more disciplined. I think that makes us, sometimes we feel like we're not enough so, or at least we're blamed for not being so. So it really matters that around the world, hopefully we're providing some collegial inspiration across the board for progressives in other countries. I think the threat of Trump, and you've kind of raised two issues. One is the Supreme Court and one is Trump, and they're not unrelated, but I do think we need to distinguish between the two. The threat of Trump is incredibly severe and significant. And it's not just Trump, but it's the radicalization of the Republican Party in a two-party system of government. We don't have a lot of parties. We don't have a governing coalition. We have two parties, essentially. And one of them has gone off the rails It isn't just about conservative economic policies, which was the case for quite some time. It's not even about, conservative views that reflect a majority of people across the country on what are called social issues. I would debate that reproductive freedom is a social issue. I think it's an economic choice as well. But I think it is the one-man cult of Donald Trump that has unleashed a whole host of other very destructive elements to democracy and to the fundamental principles of freedoms. And so that is kind of one big piece. The other is we had a sitting president attempt a coup. That's the severity of what we went through on January 6th, the worst attack on the United States Capitol since the War of 1812, with Confederate flags flying in the halls of Congress, being planted atop the Capitol, and all instigated and fueled and planned by a sitting president of the United States. And there has not been sufficient accountability for that. While some of the insurrectionists are being prosecuted, and that's good that that's happening, the reality is that the core person at the center of all of it, with everything that has come out through the January 6th Select Committee, that accountability has not happened. That needs to come from the Department of Justice and the Attorney General. And frankly, I know I don't know everything that's going on behind the scenes at DOJ, but my opinion is that Attorney General Garland is moving too slowly on something that is of incredible importance. At the same time, it has been a project of the conservative right to install a majority on the Supreme Court of justices who are radical and who are espousing radical positions that are not embraced by the majority of the country. And that's what you saw in the leaked opinion. What is stunning to me, if people around the world read that opinion from Justice Alito, which sounds like it's going to be the final opinion that comes through based on reporting, what you see is that the argument is that there is no right to anything that is not articulated in the Constitution explicitly, a document that was written 200 years ago. And so while it's true that the Supreme Court has overturned precedent in the past, it's been around precedent that stopped us from moving forward in terms of progress. And so it was Plessy being overturned, Plessy v. Ferguson being overturned for Brown v. Board of Education. It was various decisions that were overturned because they did not reflect progress. Whereas this will be the first time in my lifetime that we will see fewer rights for women than what it was 30, 40 years ago. And I think that is a terrible, terrible situation that we're in. And it only gets changed, frankly, if we can also fix the fundamental flaw of the Senate, the US Senate, and how the Senate functions, where 40 people, 40% of the body, which represents a tiny majority of the population because of the 2 senators per state, regardless of population rule, you can have a tiny majority representing only 40% of the Senate body determining what does or doesn't even get debated. I'm not just talking about passing legislation, I'm talking about even bringing a bill to the floor for debate.
And thank you for laying out that, for clearing that up. I'm wondering if you can, one of the themes of the documentary is hope, but without necessarily optimism. And I'm wondering, how do you assess the current state of the U.S. progressive movement? And given the primary obstacles blocking your agenda, how do you view the movement overcoming those?
Well, I think that I always say being a progressive just means you're the first to the best and most just idea. I think I might have said that in the film. And then everyone runs to catch up with you. That's what's happened with minimum wage. That's what's happened with so many different issues. And I do think our progressive movement has continued to build steam and scope and size across the country. And I think that really these positions that we're talking about, universal health care, minimum wage, I had the ambassador of the EU say to me that those would be conservative positions in much of Europe. And I think that we are still building here towards some basic rights that are seen as, sort of assumed, I guess, in other parts of the world and developed countries. And so I feel like we are making big progress, but we do have some structural issues that come to bear. I mean, we don't have one vote per person. So you have two presidents who have been elected who did not win the popular vote in the United States, who became president, who then appointed these 5 justices on the Supreme Court, right? Those were appointed by 2 presidents who didn't win the popular vote. So those are some of the structural issues. And unless we mobilize an even bigger progressive base, not only in the states that we already have, like Washington and California and New York, but in places in the South, we will end up having very different countries within the United States of America. That's essentially how I see it. Nations that are red and nations that are blue, that are encompassed by certain states where you have conservatives really prevailing there.
Anthony, I'd like to bring you in here. What's the significance, you think, of the US progressive movement in the current state in America for the broader international left? You're on mute. Can you please?
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here, and it's very, very nice to see Pramila again, who gave a wonderful interview. And a very inspiring one when we interviewed her in Washington in your office, Pramila, and that was very. So I think one of the things that struck me very forcibly is that there's been a tradition of the left around the world looking rather patronizingly on the United States as being very kind of backward. This is, if you like, very behind in terms of welfare and so on. But I think that there's quite a lot to learn. And one of the things that the situation which Pramila has described so clearly has forced the American left, including the liberal center, not just the progressives, to deal with is how politics happens in America. It's not just a matter of what the policies are, but actually the way in which politics is conducted. And there is a rigged system which has been described. The Republicans, as I think Larry Cohen says in the film, the Republicans, the Democrat in the Senate represent 40 million more people than the Republicans in the Senate, but they have equal representation in terms of numbers. So there's a systemic problem which involves the way politics is done. And Pramila added to this in the interview by saying that you wanted to end the sort of break the notion of the inside and outsiders, that we needed to be able to work together. And I think that this is really important for us because it's not, so to speak, what you say, but the way that you say it is not what you do, but the way that you do it. And what that means is that there's a beginning of a political culture in the United States. It's still the subordinate one. It's still the one that's trying to make an impact. But I think that in the consequences following the defeats of Obama, it's no longer the US progressives no longer just believe in electing someone, a savior. It's about getting a movement. It's about a movement addressing the rules. It's about that movement itself conducting itself in a progressive manner. It's about making sure that legislation is owned and is therefore effective. And that sense of being able to understand the process is a very important one. And just the final thing I would say is that the traditional response of traditional social democratic parties when you argue this is, oh, people on the doorstep, they're not worried, they just want outcomes. But here in the UK, a majority, when they voted for Brexit, voted to take back control. And a lot of the anger and opposition on the right is about a frustration with a sense of powerlessness. So I think that this question of the way politics is conducted is something which we have got to learn from around the world. And I think the Americans are very good at looking what's happening in America, about looking at those different processes and being very clear and articulate about them.
And that has, if I can just follow up on that, that has been something that we have really spent a lot of time on. And I, as an organizer for 20 years before coming to Congress, is building this movement for progressive policy, for progressive reforms, and really sort of putting together a multi-generational, multi-dimensional coalition of people who may articulate different policy priorities within a silo, but that we come together and we say, okay, this is the progressive vision for everybody. Because what that does is it helps bring more and more people in. You can't win in this political system with one small group of voters. You really need to have an intersectional approach to everything. And that is the way most young voters think about life. You know, I always say I'm not a mom on Monday, a worker on Tuesday, an immigrant on Wednesday. I'm all of those things all of the time. And so our platforms have become more intersectional as we've gone forward. It is about economic, racial, and social justice. We are talking about climate change and economic power at the same time. We are combining migration issues with climate issues and foreign policy at the same time. And I think that has been very important and very hopeful in terms of building a movement that's reflective of all of the things that working people face across the board. That brings us power then in the electoral process. And that's, I think, a very important piece, is that you do have to win elections and you have to get people into office who have a big enough block of power to be able to do something. It's not enough just to have one great progressive or two great progressives. And I think we have been very focused on building that electoral power, as well as the policy, the deeper policy knowledge and the organizing movement, both on the inside and the outside. And they all sort of have to go together. And that's probably where I have the most hope.
And I'd like to just to follow up on that. How do you keep such a diverse caucus together? I know there's been some criticism from the left about certain endorsements and certain tactics. How, because you're managing over basically 100 members, and they come from, some of them come from different ideological roots. They don't all have the same tactics or strategies. How do you keep it together?
It's tough. I mean, it's hard, you know, and you do get criticized from all over, and there are always going to be people who, you know, who think we're not left enough, but you have to work with the situation that you have. And you do have more power if you have more numbers. So sure, we could have blocked the infrastructure bill from coming to the floor until we got Build Back Better with just 5 votes or 6 votes or maybe 10, but it would not have had the same power in terms of the narrative to the country as blocking it with 50 or 60 votes. And so I think, you know, there is a certain, if you're going to govern, you have to govern, and you have to be in a situation where you make decisions that aren't going to be everything that everybody wants. And I never criticize people for being critical and wanting more. I think that's always a good thing. I just think we have to recognize that progressives also have to show that we can govern. I mean, we are often seen as naive, or, you know, wanting too much, or not being willing to work with what we have. And I think you got to push the edge as far as you can. You got to have the numbers to do it. You got to have the organization to do it. But at the end of the day, you have to make a decision about when to hold them and when to fold them, as they say in that song. And so I think that's a really important piece of this. And it's not easy, but it's an organizing project. I mean, how do you hold people together in a really diverse coalition? You help people to have leadership. You help people to make sure they can express their ideas. It's not that we're going to agree 100% of the time, but you have rules in place, and you help people to understand that the biggest majority is what is going to move us forward.
And Clive, I'd like to bring you in here.
Could I just make
Yeah.
one little point there? When Pramila, when you said you help people express their ideas, that's absolutely crucial. And the experience, I think Clive might be able to respond to this, that I've sensed in the Labour Party or in official British politics is you don't encourage people to express their ideas. That's the last thing you try to do. I mean, certainly that was the experience of the Blairite period, was if somebody has got an idea, well, you know, that's sort of, and I think that there's a quite a deep American democratic culture of encouraging the voice of others.
And Clive, I'd like to get you to comment on that and kind of just describe for us what you see as the progressive alliance in the UK, or one that least that you.
Well, I mean, they're kind of slightly two different. They're kind of slightly two different things. I think in terms of the point that Anthony made and listening to Pramila, there's Pramila's talking about a political culture, one that I think some of us are trying to build here. Now, inside the Labour Party, I think Anthony is right. There isn't a culture of wanting to encourage a multitude of ideas and for that debate to take place and for out of that to come to some kind of synthesis that we can democratically agree on. It's a very top-down authoritarian approach to forming policy, unless, of course, for example, you're someone like Tony Blair or someone in the political establishment, and then your voice is amplified. They want to hear it. I'm told I'm being asked by the media today to comment on something called the Blair Report. So the leadership of my party has asked Tony Blair, that's like someone going to ask Bill Clinton to tell them how they should take the Labour Party forward, or how they should take the Democratic Party forward. That will be coming out tomorrow, and I've seen some juicy tidbits from that report, and I'm not particularly impressed. But if you have a certain voice, a certain part of the political establishment, then your voice is overly amplified. But for the vast majority of people, the vast majority of members, they're suppressed. And that isn't just on what you would call the centrist part or the wing of my party. It's also on what I would call the old left of my party as well, where there is a culture of top-down authoritarianism. There were lots of brilliant things that happened under the last 5 years under Corbyn. He's our version of Bernie Sanders, I suppose. And there were lots of great things policy-wise that happened, but they were always dropped down onto the membership. It came down from the top down rather than the bottom up. And that's about political culture. So that's something where we are behind on, something that we are trying to build. And I think listening to Pramila, I think one of the things that is surprising for the left is the right got this a long time ago. They understood that cultural power must precede political power. And I mean, they've taken people like, Antonio Gramsci and others and taken those ideas and they've run with them. And I mean, that's why we're now in the midst of the culture wars, both in the US with the issue around abortion, here in the UK, and particularly issues on race and trans people. They understand that winning that war is it's partly antagonistic. It's partly a smokescreen to get through other policies that they're really concerned about. But part of it is also about winning the cultural arguments about how politics is done and about how political and actual culture operates and where the mainstream is. So I think political culture generally I don't think we must never underestimate how important that is to our politics. And listening to Pramila talk about encouraging those ideas, encouraging people to bring together their kind of sometimes conflicting ideas. I think that makes us stronger as a movement, because when you've hammered those ideas out, you've had that argument, and you can democratically decide a way forward. When those blows come in from your opponents, you're in a stronger position with that synthesis position to be able to say, well, we've heard those arguments, and here's why we came to this position. And I think that makes us stronger, not weaker. But there are those who argue in my party still that makes us look weak. And I think they're wrong.
Clive, that really, don't feel alone on that. That happens here as well in the Democratic Party. We have the establishment Democrats, longer term Democrats, people who are in positions of power. And then you've got progressives, and progressives are pretty much blamed for everything. If we win elections, it's despite progressives. If we lose elections, it's because of progressives. And so that certainly happens, I think, And, you know, there are a lot of people who say, don't put your progressive ideas forward. We don't want to talk about them. You know, healthcare is settled. We focused on the Affordable Care Act as Democrats. We don't want to talk about Medicare for all or universal healthcare. And so I think that that certainly happens. I think you're spot on that the right wing in all of our countries has figured out how to use the grassroots in a way that Democrats have not, or that, you know, or that our progressive, that our establishment sort of centrists have not. And if you look at how the Republican Party caters to its base, and then you look at how establishment Democrats often blame our base, we blame progressives, we blame young people for wanting to take on climate change, or for wanting universal health care, or for believing in trans rights or women's rights or whatever it is. And we sort of treat progressives in the United States, we treat our base as if they're stupid and they should know better, you know. But
do you think there's a similarity, Pramila, between between why and how our parties were established? I know America, the history of slavery and so on is more integral to it. But the Labour Party, in effect, was established. I mean, Anthony talked about this, but I was reading Ed Miliband, the former Labour leader. His dad wrote a book on the history of the Labour Party. And you can see that when the Conservatives and Liberals dominated, they basically said amongst themselves in Parliament, we have a superiority of numbers. Now is the time to allow this experiment of the working man to be able to try political representation for themselves. And so they allowed the Labour Party to exist. And once the Labour Party was established on that footing of being allowed to exist with the establishment's blessing, it's never really escaped from that. And therefore, the Labour Party, in some ways, has created and generated real change in our country, but it's also been a block against even more fundamental change. And at times, it's actually been very conservative in its, and it feels to me that both the Democratic Party, or the establishment of the Democratic Party, and the Labour Party are in some way the last line of defense of the establishments of our countries. They are integral to the establishment of our countries. And what you're talking about, the base, is the conflict between those two, between that bulwark and those below that actually want real fundamental change. And
yes, I think that's right. And I think that maybe the through line is power. You know, maybe it's that people who end up being in power, or who are put into power by those who are already in power, are often become disconnected, even if they maybe aren't at the beginning. And that's where some of the reforms might come in. You know, should somebody be able to serve for 35 years into their 80s? You know, I think that there are some things we should talk about there, but I think that there is this question of power. And I think a lot of us on the left have run away from power as being a bad thing, when we should be running towards power, but the correct utilization of power. And maybe that's naive to think that that can happen. But I think if you are driven by the grassroots, then you are going to be much more true to what it is you're trying to achieve. And in the United States, and I don't know how it is in the UK, but in the United States, we have been overtaken in our political system by money. And so there is so much corruption due to how elections are won and the role of big money and corporate money and wealthy individuals' money in politics, that you now have a situation with new PACs that have been formed where PACs are just dropping $1 million. One wealthy person can drop $1 million into an election to elect a member of Congress, and there's only 435 of us.
If I could just trump you, I mean, sorry, obviously I don't want to, if I can just trump you on that, we have a hereditary billionaire head of state who can trace their ancestry back hundreds of years, who sits at the center of power and sovereignty in our political system. And the message that sends out to everyone, including my own party, is simply that hereditary power, wealth, money talks. It runs our country. It is at the heart of our political system. That's where power is. So I understand, you know, big business and corporations and the media in our country are in a very similar situation. Now, I understand, you know, the big corporate sponsors and the PACs and so on. It's more visible from us here to see the direct influence of that money in your politics. But that money influences in our
It
country,
exists.
I would say just as much, but it's more opaque, in part because of the fact that we have no written constitution. That transparency isn't there. Whilst you can see it, it's happening here, but I think it's just less visible, and it's more, I think it's part of the actual institutions. You think of the City of London, the financial institutions. I mean, one of the reasons why Boris Johnson and the Conservatives took so long and dragged their feet over a kind of clamping down on the oligarchs and kleptocrats of Russia was that they were so intertwined and integrated politically and financially. They had to give them time to get their money out. They were saying to them, I have no doubt behind the scenes, they were saying to their mates, get the money out before we have to change this law. So so it's in our system as well, without doubt. I think it's just a little bit more opaque and more established.
Well, you know, I'm going to have to run because one of the other ways I keep my caucus together is we have weekly meetings. And I have to go chair one of those meetings. But what this is making me think is that we need to have much more of this dialogue between progressives in other countries and in the United States. And I think that we are going with a progressive delegation to Germany soon. And I think we should do one in the UK, or you should come here, or, we should figure out ways to have this conversation, because I think there are some similarities, there are some differences, but at the core of it, in my belief, is it's about organizing. It's about organizing a bigger base, a more diverse base, a more multi-generational base, and a multi-issue base, and then really thinking about that power both inside elected office and outside. It's not enough to just select one good member of Congress or one good member of parliament. You really need a big enough block to be able to make a difference. So with that, I'm being told I've got to go.
Okay.
That sounds like
Thank you so much for joining us. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
It.
Great to talk with you. Bye-bye.
And thank you. And unfortunately, we're running out of time for this as well, but we hope to continue this conversation moving forward and have more panels. Anthony, would you like to have the final word here?
Yeah, well, I would just echo what Pramila says, that if we can start an international conversation about these issues, I think that's very good. And one of the things I would just say especially to those who are tuning in from the UK, is that one of the themes that emerges in the film is the importance of having primaries. That one of the checks on corruption is that candidates, who are in office have to put themselves back to continuous to primaries, and can't just treat elected office as a kind of lifetime tenure. And that also is one where you can counter the influence of dark money by having transparent elections.
Absolutely.
I have a feeling that Clive agrees with that.
I do. I do. And obviously that goes into issues about how we select our candidates for parliament. It also goes into the voting system that we have here, very similar problems with the voting system and the popular vote. But first past the post, it's a system it creates safe seats, rotten boroughs, if you like. People then stay there well over time. They accumulate power, influence that's undue to them. So yeah, there was a push on that under the Corbyn years to try and do that. But that's where some of the biggest pushback came from, that entrenched political establishment in the Labour Party. They did not want their own party democratized. Our own party democratized. So yes, Anthony, I think you're right. Democracy isn't something you just talk about. You have to live it. It has to be part of your political culture, and it isn't at the moment inside the Labour Party.
Anyway, it's very good to have a real.
Yes, we're going to continue this conversation.
Yeah.
We're going to continue the conversation. Thank you to everyone so much for joining us. Please know that Open Democracy relies on contributions and donations. So if you want to support our public interest journalism, please do support us at opendemocracy.net. Thank you guys all again for tuning in, and we will be sure to continue this moving forward.